The Wildwood Trust was created to promote British wildlife education, reintroduction and practical rewilding. It's championed the use of beavers and indeed wild horses to establish semi-wild habitats. It's been at the forefront of events to reintroduce Britain's most endangered species, including the water vole, dormouse and red squirrel, to areas where they have become extinct. Please give a warm welcome to tonight's Lacey lecture speaker, Peter Smith.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honour to be invited here. And normally, people have to pay me to shut up talking about Beaver, and it's wonderful for people to pay to come and hear me talk about Beaver. So, the beaver in Wales, there's a wonderful thing. My passion for beaver started many, many years ago as a young student interested in ecology, and it's carried on. But what is it beavers can do for us?
Surveyor, builder, engineer. It's all in a day's work for a beaver. They've got the tools and the know-how to create a brand new ecosystem, one log at a time. When they build, everyone shares the reward. A beaver pond is a wildlife magnet. It's the place to find a mate and raise a family, to hunt, or fight for survival. In the center of the action, the engineer keeps the whole thing running. Building a dam? That's just part of the job. These guys will face down predators, voyage into the unknown, and battle the full force of nature, all to create their little slice of paradise.
So beavers in Wales. Beavers are indeed Welsh. Beavers probably affected 25% of the land surface of Wales for millions and millions of years, and beaver-like animals before it. They covered Wales, and that's in archaeological records all around us. The beaver is indeed an ecosystem engineer. It creates habitats, beautiful wildlife habitats. It can deliver ecosystem services in abundance. It can help humanity in the future. It can protect us from flooding. And I'll talk about all these things. The beaver even has the capacity to save the planet for our children. A bold claim, which we'll come to in the second half of the lecture. And I can talk about how we can get the best from beaver. Lots of people are worried about beavers back in our ecosystems. We can manage any issues they cause. And when we can learn about the beavers, we can find that they can teach us to have both an ecological and an economic renaissance in Wales if we learn from the way of the beaver. So let's learn about beavers themselves. What are they? From my good friend, Chris Packer.
So let's take a look at what makes a beaver a beaver.
This one, Peter, is a babe in both senses. It's a youngster, of course, and it's beautiful.
Well, he's about 14 weeks old, this little fella, so he's still very much a youngster, and that's why he's still quite chilled and happy to be held like he is.
He's got all the beaver features, though, already,
He
hasn't he?
certainly has. He's just a miniature version of the adult.
Look at these back feet. I mean, look at that spread of webbing.
Can swim fantastically fast, manoeuvre really well.
I know, look at this tail. I mean, this is an amazing adaptation, isn't it, really?
It's a little bag of muscle in there, and that is what gives them a huge thrust.
What about the teeth, though? They're huge and incredibly tough, aren't they?
Well, that's the business end of a beaver. Their teeth does all their real work. They're fantastically adapted. They are like two sets of chisels, constantly self-sharpening to a razor edge.
What about the coat, though? I mean, this is something else. These long guard hairs keep it waterproof, but beneath it there's this really thick, downy layer which is going to keep them warm, isn't it?
This is the softest, most lovely fur you could ever feel, and that's unfortunately one of the reasons they went extinct.
The extinction of beavers in Britain was the unhappy last chapter of a story which had started so well. Thousands of years ago, beavers may have paved the way for humans to settle Ice Age Britain, providing thick fur coats and energy-rich meat. But gradually, human demand for beaver parts escalated. Beaver teeth made excellent tools. And from Roman times, they were hunted both for castoreum, the anal secretion used to mark their territory, and for their testicles. It was believed that these had pain-killing properties. And medieval humans were convinced that a desperate beaver would even bite off its own testicles, leaving them for the hunter, in return saving its own life. But the thing that wiped out the beaver was its fur. One of the last ended up as a hat for Henry VIII. In the 1600s, the beaver finally went extinct in Britain. All that was left were a few archaeological remains and place names such as Beverley, which means beaver stream. So beavers disappeared 400 years ago. But does it really matter to anything other than a beaver? After all, we humans now have aspirin. Well, it could be that the beaver still has a lot to offer Britain.
So, beaver in Britain. The last records of any beaver in Britain seems to be 1749. In Wales, written records probably 1280, but written records don't tell us about when the extinction. So probably 16th, early 17th century for Wales, last beaver. Very hard to tell. A lot of Welsh people called otters and beavers the same thing. So historical records a bit tough there. But the first person to think about reintroducing beaver back to Britain was the Marquis of Bute. And on the Isle of Bute, he built a beautiful beavery and imported animals, and he employed scientists, and you can still read those works. They're available on Google Books or whatever, and it's fascinating to read about his efforts studying the ecology and biology of a beaver, and they're great works, very worth reading. Then, grey owl. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of grey owl. Archie Bellini, he was called. He created a movement in the 1920s and 30s as one of the first ever ecologists campaigning for beaver restoration, mostly from Canada, but he came over here, and if any of you have seen the film about grey owl by Richard Attenborough, it has a young David Attenborough and Richard going into one of his lectures as the final scene in the film. But they were truly inspired. Richard Attenborough, and his house was called the Beaver Lodge in London. His film company was called Beaver Films, and he bought the Marquis of Bute's old beavery, and that's where he wrote the scripts for Gandhi and a number of other Oscar-winning plays, screen scripts, in the beavery. And he was fascinated, as was Richard, in the beavers and the story of how beavers can restore ecology. There was a Beaver Reintroduction Trust for Nigel Stilwell back in the 1970s, early 80s. You could read about that in back issues of The New Scientist. That one didn't happen. Strangely, some of the beavers did end up in North Wales that he brought into the country. The BBC lost a couple of beavers making a film down in South Wales in 1976. Probably at 84 when Mr. Stilwell's beavers seemed to be running around somewhere in North Wales. Then, my little entrance into the story of the beaver into Britain came about in about 1998, 1999, where we wanted to see if one of the last fenland in the southeast of Britain had fen. And there was lots of ways we tried to do that, even using earth scrapers to take the mineralized peat. But we came up with the idea to use beaver, and that's how the Wildwood Trust came about. We started the process, and a long process it was, to get all the licenses ready, and the beavers have been on there since 2002, early 2002, and they've done a fantastic job. The Tay beavers appeared about 2001, of which there's now about 300 living in the Tay catchment. The Scottish Wildlife Trust and the Royal Zoological Society of London, they did a beaver reintroduction under licence in 2009, and a couple of months ago, because we reintroduced 2 of our beaver under licence to support and expand the genetic pool up in Knapdale. So I'm very happy about that. It's taken a long time to move that on. There's about 50 private projects all around. There's a couple in Wales, where people have got beavers in little enclosures. The Blanenion beavers started in 2012, and obviously the Welsh Beaver project is working, and that could be the one under consideration that's being reviewed at the moment. The Devon beavers, that was a huge big campaign that the Devon Wildlife Trust supported the beavers that were discovered in the Devon, and that has been a fantastic campaign. Everybody's been very happy with the outcome, and those beaver numbers are expanding greatly. Strangely, right next to the new Wildwood Wildlife Park I've just set up on the River Otter. No coincidence. And the Cornwall Beaver project was well exposed on Autumn Watch a couple of weeks ago. Another great project with some great science with the Devon project and the Cornwall project, showing how beavers do deliver the ecosystem services. And the Welsh Beaver project has been continuing under the great guidance of Adrian for many years, and sometimes I've been providing tea and sympathy to your efforts over those years. So this is Ham Fen, and this was a desiccated fenland. It was dry woodland and desiccated fenland, and the beavers have completely restored it. And so many plants have come back. You can see the hydration. It wasn't man-made drainage ditch that would dry out in the summer. The beavers have restored all of its life back to it. Waterfalls come back. There's all kinds of plants. It's a fantastic job, rehydrating the peat, and everything we wanted to achieve with Ham Fen has happened. When you ever get a chance, do go down there. It's like stepping into a different
They'll
world.
go in and up and into a nice, dry, warm area. Now we suspect that that's a current beaver home, because if you go a couple of yards further down the bank and look on the far side, you can see some recently stripped branches which indicate that beaver were active here, well, as recently as last night. Beaver went extinct in England in the 1600s after being hunted for their pelt and for food. Catholics who weren't allowed to eat meat on Fridays got round the rule by treating the beaver as a fish because of its tail and fondness for water. But reintroduction projects like this are controversial, with some farmers and anglers worried about disease and damage to the landscape, claims refuted by wildlife experts.
Virtually across the whole of Europe now, beavers are back in Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, you name it, they're back. And economic mayhem has not been caused with the re-establishment of beaver in those countries. And the reason that is so is because perhaps the difficulties associated with beaver are seriously overplayed. And secondly, that in those countries, particularly Germany and the Netherlands, they actually manage the beaver situation.
These canals were dug entirely by the beavers. They build them to be highways around their patch so they can stay safely underwater while travelling to look for food. If water levels dip, they indulge in some masterful engineering, the dam for which the animals are famous. Nearby tree trunks bear witness to the animals' sharp teeth and enthusiasm for gnawing. The results of their efforts are willow trees like this, unwittingly planted by the animals as they stored twigs for food, and flora and fauna such as this tussock sedge growing happily in the revived wetland.
They have certainly demonstrated their usefulness, their considerable benefits in wetland ecological management, and we believe that these principles could be applied at other important wetland wildlife sites.
This project is just a trial, but others are being carried out across the country. Conservationists say they hope it paves the way for what they call a keystone species to return in full. David Johns, ITV News, Sandwich.
So, what is an ecosystem engineer? What do beavers do? Well, they pretty much create all the kind of habitats that most of us in the Wildlife Trust spend our years trying to save and make. And they can do it from any field with a little stream running through. They can create deadwood, fungi, place for birds. They give structural diversity in fell trees and water ponds, wet meadows. They create diverse bank structures, give a home. They were keystone species. And they really can create amazing habitats. There's lots of scientific studies that have now shown what beavers can do in bringing back plants, animals. We can see that in studies showing where on flora that you can get a huge proliferation of some of the rarest plants in beaver habitat. This study in North Eifel, quite a good friend of mine, that's a university with, he showed, this graph here demonstrates the bottom line is the number of species of amphibians, the x-axis is the prevalence over percentage of the stream. Where you have beavers, you have a massive diversity difference to where you don't have beavers. When it comes to fish, there have been some studies that show that fish numbers can increase by 8,000% with beavers present. Obviously, these are dry streams in some places like Oregon and in California and Nevada and other places. But every study that I've read shows you get more fish and they're bigger fish when you have beavers. They can do all kinds of things to help little fish in that the beaver dams provide lots of invertebrates, food that was never there before, and they can provide structures to evade predation and have a much more diverse underwater ecosystem. Bird species. The studies in Bavaria, which has got the highest populations of Eurus beaver, all the kind of birds that most of the birders here want to preserve, from kingfishers to corncrakes, come in much greater abundance where you have beavers, compared to similar streams where you don't have beavers. When it comes to mammals, the story that got me involved with wanting beavers was reading a translation of a Russian paper that did a study between otters on rivers with beavers and comparative rivers without beavers. And effectively, you've got twice the abundance of otters, twice the number of carrying capacity, there's twice as much for otters in rivers with beavers because of the whole ecosystem shift where you have all the invertebrates coming through the fish populations can support. That means that female otters can have smaller territories and you can have more otters per mile of river back. And that got me thinking about beavers coming back when I was looking into otter conservation. You've got some studies from Poland that have shown not only do you have twice the number of species, you have twice the abundance of those species in comparative rivers between those that have beavers on and those that don't. And our own little anecdotal evidence is Ham-Fen, there were no waterfalls in Ham-Fen till we put the beavers back. Now it is hotching with waterfalls. It doesn't matter if it's mink, because they can evade predation with the rich, complex bankside vegetation, the wet woodland that allows the waterfalls to easily evade predation. And we can see that in many similar habitats, the wet woodland, the alder cars, the reed beds, where waterfalls can easily evade predation. So having beavers back, creating both the ability to escape predation, but also creating refuge habitats and flood events so those animals can survive large river floodings is what will save and reverse the calamitous near extinction of waterfalls across a lot of the UK. So, a lot of the evidence, and there's no evidence to say that beavers don't have wildlife. But what is an ecosystem engineer? What is ecosystem? Services that we all hear about, that's becoming the buzzword in the community. That's where nature can help man. And it can help man in many ways. And the beaver is the animal that will deliver a lot of those services. The beaver can improve water quality. It cuts our water bill. It really does. All those little pools, those reed beds along riverbanks they create, they will suck out sediments, pollutants, phosphates, nitrates will be metabolized, our waters will be cleaner. Those dams and those things really do filter out sediments, which is a huge economic problem to how rivers flow and causing flooding. The pollution we get from mostly farming, nitrates, phosphates, but real pesticides, fungicides, in the little nodules of your reed mace or whatever in those beaver pools, they will metabolize and fixate those pollutants, cleaning our water, reducing the need to spend so much water in purifying. Beaver ponds, they're a mini water treatment factory, but what they can do for flood prevention is quite amazing. They can really, really reduce flooding. They can really shift the peak flows and the low flows. So they retain heavy rains and then release them slowly. And even during droughts, the water that's held back still keeps getting released. So a lot of the problems, maybe not in Wales, but certainly in the south, is low flows, where it concentrates pollutants, it concentrates sewage into a horrible soup that's lifeless and everything dies. And so many rivers are in a terrible state. We're failing all of our commitments to the Water Framework Directive. In one fell swoop, beavers will solve most of those problems. And the complexity of riverbanks and how the floodplains works can all be helped by our friends. So, it's not new knowledge. If you go start studying literature, the knowledge of how beavers help farmers and lowlands and how they provide ecosystem services been around for a long time. This is a passage from Time magazine from America in 1939. And it tells us that the beavers and the various wildlife authorities in America started reintroducing beavers. And in Idaho, they were having huge problems with the rivers becoming silted and causing real big problems further down. Desiccation of land, erosion, and a lot of farming had to be abandoned. This was going on in a time when all of those areas were suffering the Great Dust Bowl and ecosystem problems all over. And the beavers solved Idaho's problem. And as I said, now, at the time, there were some documentaries made about them, and you can watch it here.
Meanwhile, in Idaho, workmen trap beavers to put them to work for the government. You know, it's the habit of the little animals to collect wood for their homes, and the dams that result have been found to keep the streams free from silting up. So to save this clogging and the erosion of the banks that sets in when silt does form, the beavers are trapped and taken to those places where the trouble is bad. There they start their dam building, if you'll pardon me, all over again.
This man is carrying beaver live traps. He is on his way to a beaver pond, where he will remove the busy engineers. Into the streams they go, sometimes carried in sacks for short distances. Several beavers are planted at each site. Sometimes planting sites are available near the road, and the beaver may be released right from the transporting crates. Every summer for years past, Idaho beaver have been on the move in this manner. Countless numbers have been supplied for streams and lakes to bring the beaver population back to its former position. On the shores of Payette Lake are crates full of beavers, part of a shipment to be dropped in the primitive area by parachute from an airplane. A conservation officer runs suspension ropes through the beaver drop box. The drop crates are loaded into the airplane. The plane makes a careful approach, ready for the drop. Now into the air and down they swing, down to the ground near a stream or a lake. The box opens and a most unusual and novel trip ends for Mr. Beaver. He's on his way now. His nose and his instinct tell him where to find the water. There's room here for a new home.
So, many people have realized beavers can solve our problems. In Idaho, they really did solve their problems. They didn't have to do it after the 50s because the beavers solved the problems. And that allowed lots of farmers to farm very well out and down the catchment, but they knew they had to keep the upper catchments full of beavers to do their little magic, providing water when it's needed and stopping water when it's not needed. So what have we had the problem in the UK and Wales? We're suffering much higher peak flows of water. Now, the science on this is very complicated. If you read about rainfall patterns, we're not really getting more rainfall than we used to. There's not that much evidence. There's to do with, some of the storms can be harder. But the biggest change over the last 100 years is what we've done to our land. That land can't retain the water anymore. That land is drained all over, whether it's the uplands, the lowlands, the floodplains. We've put in bunds and dams to shove that water ever further down. So in Boscastle, where somebody died, that little flash flood, there was nothing to stop that water coming into the town. And it's costing the Environment Agency a fortune. It's a real political hot potato. Now, our friends the Beaver can solve that. And that's a lot of money that could save us. And we're getting more and more flood events, and they're becoming more and more dangerous. And therefore, it costs a lot of money. So we've already tried to look at how beavers do this. There's some little studies on little areas, but this study in the town of Belford, very close to where I come from, in Northumberland, the town never used to flood. Never. And yet, over the last 30 years, changes in agriculture, reversion from grazing to arable, drainage in the upper catchment, which never used to be farmed, suddenly the town's flooding every year. So, the wise people at Newcastle University and the Environment Agency decided to make an artificial beaver and put all the structures that a beaver creates. They created ponds at the bottom of farmers' fields to hold water and slow its flow. They fell trees that diverts, when the stream is in torrent, it diverts the water, goes back into the ground. They created berms to slow down and slow that flow. It cost £1.5 million to do that, and they have to make rental payments for those structures to the landowners. But we subsidised those landowners to drain their land in the first place and to farm it. We made the arable farming economic through government subsidies. And so we created the problem. So you've got to think, why didn't we just release a few beavers? It would have cost us nothing. Not a penny. Our friends, Chris Packard and Michaela Strachan, demonstrated this on the television.
Shows a cross-section of the British countryside. So here you've got the uplands, no trees there. We've deforested our uplands in many places, sadly. No trees on the slope either, and we've drained all of this area. So, Michaela, let's see what happens when we have an extreme weather event, lots of very heavy rain, as we're seeing with climate change.
This is Storm Strachan.
And it races down the hill,
down,
and it
knocking all the
gets
houses over
to Little Trumpton at the bottom. And it completely submerges it.
Okay, in goes the beaver. It's quite a big beaver there. Look at the size of it. We haven't gone to scale. I mean, look, it's as big as the houses. Okay, and I'll put that. And there's another one. There's another dam that our beaver has built, and that's going to go in there.
Okay.
I think we've drained it, haven't we? Okay.
An extreme weather event here. And what happens? Oh, look at the beaver dams are holding up the water. They're slowing the flow. It's merely trickling down. And Trumpton, well, OK, the drains are overloaded on the streets, but it's not up around people's washing machines and sofas. And it's still actually a little bit silty, but in real life, it certainly would.
So, far better demonstrated than I could. But getting into the real world, we've got all kinds of policies. We're supposed to be following the Water Frameworks Directive. We've utterly failed in every way, shape and form, Britain, in the Water Frameworks Directive, to do anything. And why is that? Well, the Environment Agency of Natural Resource Wales can't get a hold of the land to do the work needed to create all of the structures you need to have a functioning river catchment system that protects both people and wildlife. And all of the things they want to create in the Water Frameworks Directive, guess what beavers can do? Every single one. For nothing. £0 and £0. But, how are we doing on time? Plenty. Excellent. So I said beavers can save our children and mankind. That's a bold statement, a grandiose statement. Am I talking rubbish, or is this in truth? Believe it or not, I was once a proper scientist and used to do a lot of computer modelling, really genetics, population data. But I like running a few numbers. And when we look at global warming, we have to take a step back and look at the big picture. Where is carbon in our biosphere? Well, most carbon is in the deep blue sea, but that doesn't interact with our atmosphere. That's pretty much locked away. We need a full species extinction event, a full, mass extinction event to get a feedback loop to release that carbon into the atmosphere, like a huge meteorite hitting us or a ginormous supervolcano. Normally, you only have about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 active in the atmosphere. Then we can come and have a quick look. It's plant biomass. That's about 5 equivalents moving around. Human emissions is only 9 gigatons a year. You have all these processes. This is why some people think climate change is a load of rubbish. It's not. But when you push that up, if we're pushing 9 gigatons in the atmosphere, the only way to bring out that carbon dioxide is in sedimentation in the oceans, which it can only do about 2 gigatons. So we're thrusting it up there. But in all the climate models, you forgot the soil. The soil contains 2,300 gigatons of carbon on the planet. And a lot of our climate models have not modelled how much carbon has been released. Some models say about 25%, could be a lot more than all the fossil fuels put together. And it needs serious study in the future. And I've been trying to stimulate that research. It's one of the reasons I was down at the university this afternoon, is we need to start looking at what we've done to our soils. So, we'll start over here. We've got arable. How much carbon is in arable land? Well, it's about 1.4 tons of carbon per hectare. Not a lot. In some farmers' fields, they're getting really bad. They're down to half a ton of carbon per hectare. Because it's really an inorganic substrate on modern farmers' fields. They just pour fertilizer on, the plants growing. There's no core carbon, nutrients, organic matter. A woodland, you think? Excellent. Woodland, it's got tons of wood, tons of carbon. It's actually got 85 tons of carbon per hectare because their soil structures are not great in woodland, especially plantation woodlands. Ancient woodlands, real best British ancient woodland, it's about 100 tons per hectare. Heathland, we all love heathlands, got a little bit more structure, but remember, heathlands, kind of man-made, not really natural habitats. I know we all love to preserve them, but they are man-made. Let's look at a real natural habitat, a dwarf scrub. That's what the rewilded habitat. That can contain 211 tons of carbon per hectare. There's some of our really rare grasslands are fantastic soil structures. They can have up to 438 tons of carbon per hectare. They're fantastic. Not many of them left, but they really are. It takes many thousands of years to build them up. Wetlands, your reed beds, open water, you can get in sediments, you can get up to 500 tons of carbon per hectare. And we use the wet woodland type of habitat beaver create we can get up to 625 and 700 tons of carbon per hectare. But that's not the full picture, because there's one other habitat that we've lost a vast amount of in this country, and the beaver has the ability to recreate. So let's put it on a little bit of a different scale. There's all our habitats left out there. What's the last habitat? Well, that's peatland. And peatland can have 5,000 tons of carbon per hectare. So if you start modelling beavers being in, say, 30% of the rivers of the UK, the rate of sequestration of carbon back into the soils is about the same as the amount of all the CO2 we're pumping out as humans. And it's quite staggering. We've lost an unfathomable amount of carbon through the drainage of wetlands and peatlands over the last few hundred years. And that's now going on at a vast pace across tropical regions, all over Africa and South America and Asia. They are busy draining soils at an unbelievable rate to put in their little palm oils and their soya beans and their cattle grazing, and the amount of carbon dioxide being released is quite fantastic. So, beavers may be able to save us, but we've got to think about how we manage beavers, right? Because I'm here saying, yeah, let's go on, beavers are fantastic, but they do cause some problems. There's lots of reasons why people think we shouldn't have beavers. And what are these reasons? They cause floods. Yeah. Having a beaver at the bottom of your garden, it's going to flood your garden. But it'll stop the town flooding further down. Who's more important? Your field or the town further down? How do you balance those needs? Because little floods stop big floods. And we have to be open about that. Some people, you can't have a river system with no flooding. The river, when a big river goes into flood, it can only carry about 1.5% of the volume of water that's going down it. So there's no way on this earth you can ever stop a flood happening in a major rain event. Fish. Loads of people tell me fish migration, shocking, it's going to stop my salmon going to their spawning grounds. No, it's not. Every single bit of evidence, there's a tiny amount of evidence in certain types of really steep areas that it could stop salmon migrating. But all of the scientific evidence from written peer-reviewed papers show that where you get beaver, you get more salmon, more trout, and they're statistically bigger because of their effects in the rivers. So there is no evidence that it's going to prevent fish migrating at all. And they eat crops. Well, yeah, they do. They love sugar beet. They really do. But, you know, beavers don't really go further than 20 meters from the river. So we can put electric fence up. Or we can have nice big riparian margins, can't we? Kind of things that'll save water holes and all the other animals we want to save, you know. It'd be nice. And then they wouldn't raid crops. And it's not that many crops. They eat trees. Chop down trees. Lots of them. How many trees do you think a beaver chops down? Again, only next to the river. Certainly not going to affect any of the commercial woodland in Wales. It might affect a bit, but most of those trees living by on the edges of rivers are not going to be commercial anyway because they kind of grow wonky and they won't be worth that much money because they're nice straight trees off the river. And, you know, a few trees, not many. And also, with disease, and I've had to deal with disease issues, and various people who've been against beaver reintroduction have told me that our beaver might have borrelia. So we had to go and search for somebody to have a test. Luckily, somebody at a place in Sweden, Stockholm University, had a test for borrelia. We tested them, no. But it did take a lot of time. They said that the Devon beavers had Echinococcal multilocularis, and they didn't. And there was a report from Health England that said it was rubbish. The beavers didn't. But we've got great vets, we've got great tests. We can stop disease, you know, as long as it's done properly and efficiently. And this is one of the benefits of having the Welsh Beaver Project, is that it'll do it properly and not have one of our beaver bomber friends come over in their plane and drop them out at night without anybody knowing. So we can manage the problem. And after our little break, I'm going to show you how we can manage the problems. And then I'm going to show you how the economics of allowing beavers to come back will create thousands and thousands of jobs and allow both economic and ecological revival in the Wales.
So Gani Croeso yn ôl i'r llwyfan, please. Can we give a welcome back to the stage, please, Peter Smith.
Thank you for that, and I do want your hardest questions. Think deeply. Test me. I really want to be tested. So, we were talking about problems with beavers, and this gets us to thinking about what are these economic issues I was talking about. You know, the conflicts in our environment. Why is it that some people not want to have our little friends, beavers, back? And a perfect example is our friend salmon here. So, salmon and trout fishers, the Angling Trust, which is, you know, there's a lot of their board directors are salmon and fishing owners. Now, all the scientific evidence is telling us that our friend the beaver will create more fish. And they do. And they'll create bigger fish. I'd have thought salmon fishers would be really happy. They have more fish. And they're going to have bigger catches. I thought that's what all these fly fishers wanted, getting the big salmon, the big trout. But there's a little problem. And it's not the fishermen per se that's the problem. Now they tell us that these beaver dams that they create in upland stretches will stop fish migrating. They do. Salmon and trout can jump over these dams very easily, and that's been pretty much tested. But there's something about beavers. They do change our rivers slightly. So what is it about these sites? Now, if we go back and have a look, where you can actually fish for salmon is quite restricted. The river bottom has to be a certain type, it has to be a certain depth. Our little friendly salmon and trout have to feel protected from predation to feed. And that's when they're feeding, is when they'll bite on the flying fish's line. And it has to be just the right shape. And there's a lot of money to be made by having your right type. In fact, parts of Scotland, there's even a few places in Pembrokeshire where you can fish for salmon, and the cost of that rod license, 500, 1,000, a couple of places charging 5,000 quid a day. They can get, the person will pay that to be able to cast his line and catch that salmon. So our beavers can move that right place 200 yards down the river. Now that's not that landowner's property anymore, is it? So it's the economic interest of that one person who owns that bit of stream that's the natural resource. He didn't create it, but it's worth a lot of money to them. And that's why they don't want beavers. Not because beavers hurt fish populations, but because it will change a little bit of that natural resource. And there comes in the problem of many of the problems of human-wildlife conflict. It's not that there's a real conflict, but there are certain economic interests. And the beaver can kind of teach us, if we have a good, hard think about it, we can kind of think, how can we overcome this problem economically to realise the profits to be made from this, just another ecosystem service, fishing for salmon, and how we can reward and compensate and deal with these problems. Another way to deal with beaver problems is the good old beaver deceiver. Simple pipe, you get a little bit of pig netting around the back end, you can then regulate the water levels of any beaver dam that comes about. This happens all over America and Europe. Lots of people setting up beaver deceivers, and you can make sure that flooding doesn't happen too much. You can put in electric fences to protect your sugar beet. It's quite nice, and that will stop them. Or you can have wide margins to stop beavers eating your crops. And you can always catch the beavers and move them somewhere else. That's happening. They were trying to do that up in Scotland the other week. It might work for them, unfortunately. But that happens all over America and in Europe where they've got beavers. Especially if you've got a road bridge and a beaver starts undermining it. It doesn't happen that often. Or sewage works. You just pick up all the beavers, trap them, move them somewhere else. So, mitigation and compensation strategy. You have to think, if we're going to have beavers back, we have to have mitigation, i.e. the vast army of volunteers with the Welsh Beaver Project jump into their vans and run around and put some chicken wire around a tree at the bottom of somebody's garden to stop it getting chopped down. Or they put in a beaver deceiver where a dam's put in to lower the water flow so it doesn't hurt any infrastructure. Or they come and trap the beavers and move them somewhere else if it's a bit of serious public infrastructure. And you don't have to do that much, not that many problems, but it can be done. That's mitigation. But what happens where you want the really good work of the beavers to happen, where they're going to really do some good flood prevention, they're going to create wonderful habitats, they're going to stop the silt? Then sure, you want to compensate the poor landowner for having these beavers on his land. But that costs a lot of money. And most landowners, rightly so, are very wary of receiving any compensation. But there's a way of doing it that doesn't require government handouts or for us to assess the value of said ecosystem services. So we want to create this system where nobody wins big, get a free lunch, get money for doing nothing, but nobody really loses as well. The winners compensate the losers. So how do we achieve this nirvana of human-wildlife culture? Pretty complicated. But if we study the works of some of Wales's greatest minds, they have already told us the solution. If we study the works of Robert Owen, an early social reformer, he understood this problem, and it is the problem of rent, economic rent, and how economic rent worked. Nye Bevan understood this very well, beautifully shown in his housing policy. My favourite writer on the subject, Bertrand Russell, another Welshman, he explained this beautifully in his writings. He understood this perfectly because he had read the works of the, well, you've probably never heard of him, but he's my hero, the Henry George, who wrote The Great Progress of Poverty, demonstrating that where you have monopoly, you can have no progress, because monopoly always absorbs the productive capacity of humanity. And we've got this today, land values, house prices. You know, we've all been doing wonderful things, we're far more efficient, we're using far more natural resources, but there's a ton of poverty, and that's because house prices are high. All of our extra work, all of the profits to be made from destroying natural resources have just pushed up house prices. They haven't gone into the pockets of most of us. In fact, for the bottom third of the population of this country, over the last 30 years, their disposable income has gone down. And that's like no fault of their own, they're not feckless, or no more feckless than they were. It's purely that land prices have gone up. So it costs more to provide employment for them, it costs more to house them, and that high price of getting access to land to do meaningful work means that they are below the margin and they have to be functionally unemployed. That's what we were taught. That's the message they give us. So first off, we've got to understand land economics, and it's not well understood. The rent of land. And because all the benefits that the beavers will give us will bubble up into the land values of the towns and houses that have received the economic services. When the water bills cut, when the insurance costs against flood prevention for your house insurance is being factored in, they will lower. But that won't appear. All it means is the land value under the house will go up to absorb the ecosystem service provided, or the rental value. In economics, we like to talk about rental value. It's a better way of describing it. Of the land, not the house. So we need a way to extract that uplift in land value and use that to pay for the landowner up the stream whose land value has gone down, or realisable land value, or rental income from that land, who is now providing an ecosystem service. In doing that system, you will create a way of absorbing the benefit and the payback for providing the ecosystem services. You can, of course, take a lot more tax from that system and cut out income taxes. Maybe even lower VAT, the worst of all our taxes. That really is something that causes poverty. And that way, you can have more jobs. You can have more economic activity, but that economic activity is directed in a way that doesn't hurt the environment. It's complex economics, much more complicated. I've spent 20 years trying to learn this. So the first thing, the lie that we're constantly told, the perverse incentive that we have in our economy is that you make money from destroying wildlife. And that's what all of us are fighting against. Everything we do is fighting against the economic pressure that people can be made from destroying wildlife. And if we do this same economic system, shift our tax base from work and trade and taxes on real capital to monopolies like land values, like other forms of monopoly intellectual property rights. We put taxes on to have a carbon tax, put taxes onto environmental externalities. We find that we will direct all of human effort into being productive, but not hurting the planet and not creating a monopoly that impoverishes the next person. And that's a fundamental solution to all our wildlife problems. It will allow much of our land that's not very good for agriculture to come out of agriculture. It will concentrate development in towns and cities, but it will make the development we have much better. Because we're not taxing property, the built property, we're just taxing the land value. It incentivizes people to build better, to provide better, in the most environmentally friendly way. So we can take the idea of a futile trade-off. We're constantly presented with arguments that we can either have jobs or wildlife. Which are we going to choose? Are we going to choose for our neighbour to be in poverty? Are we going to have that lovely little robin in the bottom of our garden? Or the otter? That is a futile trade-off. It's not real if we change the economic system we've got. We can get rid of these silly futile trade-offs. We can have nature and we can have economic development if it's done right. And it doesn't need man to tell us, we just need the economic system to provide those incentives. And that's indeed what I think beavers are telling us. And if we take our wisdom from our forebears, these great men of Wales, and start using the Welsh Assembly's tax powers to shift a few of these taxes, reform, first of all, council tax, to come off property values to just be base rent, land rent values. If we increase that amount and can reduce other taxes, we will start shifting how we use land and more will become available for wild.